In the book, The Nightly News Nightmare, which I wrote with Bob Lichter, who teaches at George Mason University, in this book, we looked at the elections going back to 1988. And so we see pretty much a downward trajectory in terms of the seriousness of the coverage. Not only do we see a decline in terms of the coverage of substance versus the horse race, which is probably our biggest concern, and perhaps the most important for the viable political conversation after the election. That's a very, very important part of what's going on here. In 1988, television, network television especially, still ruled the political conversation. I mean, there were newspapers out there, and certainly political elites and other people who were paying a lot of attention to politics would be looking at the newspapers. But most people in America by the 1980s were really still getting their news in the same way that they did in the 60s and the 70s, that it was primarily those half-hour evening newscasts that still exist that ABC and NBC and CBS had. At this time, there was no Fox News. There was a CNN and a C-SPAN, but the coverage that most people were paying attention to were these big three networks. There was no internet to speak of. There was a little government national security internet, but for ordinary people, they were not online in this era. Cable was still out there, but the audience for CNN was a fraction of what you were seeing with the big three networks. As we look at the media today, it's pretty lowly regarded by the American public. The public, when they're asked after the election to give grades to the media, the grades routinely are lower than most college students would want to receive. These are C's usually in many cases, sometimes even C minuses for the television and the other media outlets that are in the campaign. So you have a situation where you're really looking at a very difficult environment for the media. The audience is also shrinking, particularly for television and newspapers, the traditional media of a generation ago. The audience is smaller, the attention is reduced, revenues are falling, and this creates a very difficult problem. It's like fast food journalism, I think, is a way to think about it, because what you have going on here is complicated matters. You know, when you think about, okay, well, let's say you want to fix America's healthcare situation, or you want to fix the deficit. What is the 10-second soundbite? How do you explain in 30 seconds even about how you want to fix these problems? I mean, these are complicated issues with a lot of moving parts, and so it is very hard for television, which is constantly dealing with a short attention span public, to come up with a way to talk about issues intelligently. I think television needs to do a better job in this regard. Those segments are 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes for a really long one, and so that's not a lot of time to talk about much more than he said, she said, or the candidate visited a flag factory, or there's this video about the 47%. These are the kinds of things that television especially can really hone in on, because the story is simple, the narrative is clear, and people in many ways, are not, programmed, of course, because one of the things that happens is if you eat a lot of fast food, you tend to like fast food. And so if you're used to a lot of the junk food journalism that television provides, you're going to look for more and more of that. And so television has created, I think, in some ways, a big problem for themselves, because when people want to know what these candidates will do if they're elected, how are you going to get the economy moving again? How are you going to fix health care? What are you going to do about those tens of millions of people who are working but don't have health insurance? What are you going to do for them? And those conversations are really complicated. I mean, it's a lot more fun maybe to talk about Bill Clinton and his personal life than it is to talk about Bill Clinton's plan for fixing health care. It's a lot more interesting to talk about Barack Obama and the questions of where he's going to go for his summer vacation, or these issues of what's going on with the First Lady and how much it costs to travel when the White House goes around the country. These kinds of things are very simple and easy to grasp. Then to talk about, well, okay, here's where we are with respect to austerity and infrastructure spending, and where we are with respect to the Fed and these other issues. I think that at its best, the media can really inform the public and create an environment in which there can be an effective conversation. Ideally, the candidates themselves would also provide a lot of substance in what they have to say. But candidates have to get on the media. I mean, they want the free media, and so even though they may have very detailed plans, like Romney and Obama did, or McCain and Obama 4 years earlier, the conversation isn't really about those plans. The conversation is about the trip to Europe and whether Obama as a candidate for president should have gone to Berlin and to Paris. And John McCain, spent his day when Obama was in Germany, spent his day having lunch at a German-American restaurant in Ohio, and he stood outside the restaurant talking about why campaign should be conducted in the United States, which is lovely from the point of view of news. You package it, you send it off, there's your 60 seconds, you're done for the day. But from the point of view of a conversation about where the country is going, particularly when you think about 2008 and all the problems we had at that environment, it's really not satisfactory. And it creates, I think, a real problem. Remember, we, the public, own these airwaves. The networks have a public duty to inform us. That's part of the deal that allows them basically a license to print money, because obviously the limited broadcast spectrum, when you talk about CBS or NBC or ABC, there's in Washington, for example, it's Channel 4, it's Channel 7, it's Channel 9, and there are a lot of people who would love to be Washington's Channel 4 or Channel 7 or Channel 9, but somebody else already has that, and they can make money with that frequency. And the exchange for the public airwaves being licensed to an individual broadcaster is this public trust, this public duty to inform. And some places do a better job than others, but what we've seen over the last several election cycles going back more than 20 years is this downward spiral. And we think that's a really important thing to draw public's attention to and to draw the media attention to. I mean, I've talked to reporters about these findings, and one of the things that they often say is, well, they're under so much pressure from their editors. There's only so much time. They have to limit it. They have to keep it simple. They have to assume maybe the worst about the American public, about how sophisticated they are about politics and how interested they are. And as a result, the coverage moves in this trivial direction. Now, for really motivated citizens, you can use the internet, of course, and get all the information that's out there, and it's infinite practically in terms of what you can find about a given subject. But one of the problems that a lot of people are going to have when they try to go down that road is they're not editors. They don't know necessarily, without spending a lot of time thinking about it, the quality of the source of the web page that they're looking at. They don't necessarily know who actually generated this content that they're looking at. And so if you just simply rely on what pops up on a Google search for deficit, you may not get a really comprehensive and effective understanding of the financial problems that this country faces. And this is why the media in campaigns are so important, because if you don't have this kind of filtering, if you don't have this kind of judgment by experienced professionals that gives you what you need to know, it's a lot more work to figure this out on your own, and most people simply are not going to stick with it. And so this is one of the reasons why we're not having a national conversation. We're having all these little conversations in these different groups, the people who listen to the, to the talk radio, the people who listen to the Daily Kos, they look at the Drudge Report online. I mean, they have very different ideas about what's going on in this country, and they don't even have an agreement on what the problem is and how they would define it. And so you have a situation where it's very difficult in this media environment for politicians to govern. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that the media do not do a better job of laying out the challenges and the problems that this country faces. Print does a much better job than television, but print still has to compete with television. And so there's even a race to the bottom when you look at the way that the New York Times or the Washington Post would have covered a campaign back in the days of Michael Dukakis and George H.W. Bush, and the way in which these campaigns are covered in the internet age. The challenge for today's politics is more than just winning the news cycle. I mean, in many ways, it was much easier to be a politician 30 years ago or 25 years ago. All you really had to do was focus on keeping the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN and the networks happy. If you could do that, you were golden. You gave them information. They ran the stories, hopefully, from the point of view of the campaign, in the way that you wanted to frame them, and all's right with the world. Nowadays, you can't win the news cycle and call it a day. You have to win the Twitter cycle, which is instantaneous. You have to win the Facebook cycle, which is also instantaneous. And so you have a situation where you have to work so much harder as a campaign to try to control the conversation, not just on network television, which is still important for the older voters, but also try to bring those younger voters to your side. In many ways, one of the bigger problems that we're now seeing in elections is, and the coverage because it has to be so instantaneous, the reporters are making a lot of mistakes. I used to be a journalist before I became an academic, and I know how hard it is to try to collect all the information and to be fair and to put everything into the proper context and balance. I used to do it for a living, but I did it before the Twitter age. I didn't have to put something out that moment. I had time to think about it. I had time to make that extra call. I had time to confirm something. And what you're seeing now is this rush to be first, the rush not just in Twitter and not just on Facebook, but even on the web pages of news organizations, or breaking live with all those hours to fill on the breaking news channel of CNN or Fox News or wherever you might go for that. It creates a great temptation to be fast rather than accurate, because these are things that are in conflict. To get it right takes time, but you don't have time in today's media. Things are said and then they're unsaid, and the difficulties are really hard, because the old Mark Twain adage, you know, that a lie goes all the way around the world before truth gets its boots on, is really, I think, a warning for us all in the Twitter, Facebook age. I think that the information out there is so overwhelming that we have a lot to work with, but on the other hand, we also have a much greater responsibility in terms of figuring out what really is true and what's not.